You know, there is a special pleasure in being an educator, and I think it is the pleasure to dream of a better world. One of the interesting findings for those who investigate the profession of education is that almost all teachers, almost all school leaders are dedicated people. God knows we aren't in it for the money. We're in it because we care about the world. We are educators because we feel a commitment to the generations to come. We are concerned about the lives our students are living today and the lives they will live tomorrow. We would like to see our students engaged. We would like to see them thriving in the pleasures of learning. We would like to see them absorbed in the meaningfulness of what happens in school. This is our dream, and it's an important dream. It's a dream that has always driven education forward. And to pursue that dream in today's times, we need to look beyond the dream to the puzzles it poses. Today, I would like to invite us all to have a conversation with ourselves and our colleagues about one of the most fundamental puzzles of education, about a problem that we all have to face day by day. It's a very fundamental question, and the question is, what's worth learning? What's worth learning? That question is especially important today because of the world in which we live. Traditionally, we have educated for the known. We have taught from the established canon of knowledge, the skills that have been anointed by past generations, the choices that have been made about the content that's worthy of learning. We have educated for the known. But in pursuit of our dream, let's try an exercise of the imagination. Suppose we could receive postcards from the future. What would that future be like? What kinds of skills would that future demand? What kinds of knowledge and understanding would that future demand? If only we received postcards from the future, excuse me, we would be in a much better position to plan today's curriculum. We would be in a much better position to make the choices we have to make every day about what to teach. Unfortunately, I don't get postcards from the future. I imagine no one from the room gets postcards from the future. And so, as educators, we have to make the best guesses we can. And even at higher levels, the levels of state and national planning, the levels of ministry, those figures have to make the best guesses they can. And we have to do that in the face of a complex world, a world that's becoming digitalized, a world where transportation is ever more efficient, a smaller world, a world where conflicts continue to persist, a world that now has a global economy that swings this way and that way. We have to educate in the face of a world changing in directions of which we cannot be entirely sure. We have to educate for the unknown, not just the known. Well, what kind of a challenge is this, educating for the unknown? That's what I hope we can engage today. That's the kind of conversation I hope we can have with ourselves and with our colleagues over time as we continue our pursuit of a better world and a better education. One inspiration for this comes from an author from the United States by the name of Neil Postman. In 1995, he published a book called The End of Education. Now, that's a rather scary title. I should say that in English, end is ambiguous. It's a play of words between end as the end and end as the purpose. End can mean purpose in English. So what Postman really means is, what's the purpose of education? He wants to scare us with a clever title. And on the very first page of the book, he has this to say. He worries about how we adults organize education and suggests that we adults face two fundamental questions. One, he calls a question of engineering. The other, he calls a metaphysical question. What does he mean? Well, by the engineering question, he means the questions of means toward established ends. How can we teach better what we already want to teach? How can we do the same job better? That's the engineering question. The metaphysical question is, what job should we be doing? What's worth learning? What should we be trying to get students to learn? The metaphysical question is our topic today. Not the question of method, but the question of goal. And here it is, what's worth learning? I have to say, when I have a conversation with myself about this question, I feel that it is one of the most frightening questions in education. It's very difficult, it's very political, it's very complex. And yet, it seems to me that if we are to move forward in education, we need to grapple much more with this fundamental question, what's worth learning, than we usually do. In fact, if you look around the world, many schools, many clusters of schools, and many nations are today beginning to struggle with this fundamental question, what's worth learning? And we can see that in what schools are doing and in the directions in which a number of national frameworks, including the European Union frameworks, are saying. Let me give you some examples of this. One theme that's been very prominent in the last decade is getting beyond content. Let's not just pay attention to traditional content, let's pay attention to 21st century skills or 21st century competencies. Many frameworks around the world foreground such skills and competencies today. Here's another beyond. Let's get beyond the local. Let's not just be concerned with our own nations, with our own nation's history, with our own nation's culture and art. Let's move toward a global perspective. Let's understand one another better. Another theme, let's get beyond the learning of topics. Let's just not learn about, the French Revolution, or about, let's say, basic algebra. Let's learn to do things with the content. We would like our students to be thinking with the content they're learning, not just learning about it. We would like the content that students are learning to become tools active in their lives. Another theme, getting beyond the disciplines in their most traditional forms. Today, the disciplines invite renewing. What can our students learn from, let's say, very basic neuroscience? What can they learn from new perspectives on history? Let's not just stay with the traditional disciplines, but renew the disciplines. Another theme, let's get beyond isolated disciplines because the disciplines speak powerfully to one another. And many major problems of the world, for instance, problems of ecology or problems of conflict and peace, are inherently interdisciplinary in character. And yet another theme, in some schools, the aim is to make education much more of a negotiated process where students have a much greater choice in the topics and skills that they study in depth. This does not mean that in such schools the basics are ignored. They are not ignored, but nonetheless, there's a much greater choice and a motivating choice for individual students. Now, consider all these themes of going beyond where we typically are today. All of these beyonds represent a kind of a restlessness with where schools typically are today. They represent a concern that perhaps typical education is just not meaningful enough for today's students. It's just not engaging enough. It's just not powerful enough in their lives. Maybe we can do better. Maybe that's the conversation we need to have with ourselves. Maybe we need to reach toward an education that is experienced by learners as more significant and experienced by learners as more empowering than we typically see today in the lives those learners are likely to live. Imagine such a world. Dream of such a world. Dream of such schools. If we had such schools, we could expect that students would be truly engaged with the pleasures of learning, that they would not, as they so often do, find today's lesson and tomorrow's lesson not relevant to their lives, just some activity to get past, just some game to get through. Well, personally, I find it useful to put a name or a phrase to this notion of learning that is significant and empowering in the lives that learners are likely to live. And in English, I call it life-worthy. It's a neologism. It's a coined term. And in Italian, we thought that this phrase might do the job. Apprendimento prezioso per la vita. Learning that is experienced as truly meaningful to the lives that learners are likely to live. Well, I spoke earlier of a conversation with ourselves that we need to have with our colleagues. That conversation is about this fundamental question, what's worth learning? And that conversation is about what is truly life-worthy. What kind of learning will truly last and prove significant and empower learners in the lives they are likely to live? That question is a powerful question. That question is a dangerous question because as we explore that question, it challenges over and over again a considerable part of traditional content. Here's a little map of how we might explore this issue today. What's worth learning? What is truly life-worthy in the face of the many unknowns that today's learners will face in their lives? First, I'd like to share the notion of big understandings and big questions and suggest that one way to think about what's truly life-worthy is to think about it in terms of big understandings and big questions. Second, I'd like to raise a warning that we often spend too much time teaching niche understandings that aren't very important in the lives learners are likely to live. Third, it's worth recognizing, though, that some small niche understandings can be enlarged to be meaningful. And that's an important enterprise. Fourth, even if we look only at big understandings and big questions, the world today is complicated, it's rich. There's far too much to learn, even for learning of the most worthwhile kind. So how do we make those difficult choices about what's worth learning? Fifth, any choices we want to make about what's worth learning have to face political realities and have to be balanced against three competing agendas in the politics of education. And later on, I'll talk about what those three agendas are. Sixth, it's worth making a quick comparison here to the framework for key competencies of the European Union. So I'll say a few words about the framework for key competencies and how that fits into this conversation we want to have with ourselves. And seventh, just summing up and saying a few words in conclusion. So that's the menu. Let's begin with the first course. Big understandings and big questions. Excuse me. Thank you. Something I've enjoyed doing over the past several years is from time to time asking people I meet what learning from their own early education has proved meaningful in their lives. What has lasted and proved significant? You might try that yourself sometime. It's a very interesting question to ask a colleague or a friend. What has lasted from your early education and what has proved significant? I have two observations to make about the kinds of answers I get. Observation number one, some people have great difficulty giving an answer. Now, everyone says, oh, well, basic literacy. Well, basic numeracy, of course. But beyond basic literacy and numeracy, in terms of big ideas, many people don't have much to say. But some do, and I'm going to share a couple of answers with you. One person answered, the French Revolution. Well, I have to say this answer was a surprise to me. If I ask somebody, what's one of the most important things to you that you learned, I don't really expect people to answer, the French Revolution. But look at what this person said about the French Revolution. It's really not just the revolution itself, but what the revolution illustrates. The way it provided this person with tools to think about other events, tools to think about politics, tools to think about society. And in fact, this person went on to discuss with me how important this became to his political and social life, how it helped to shape his commitments as a citizen and his actions as a citizen. So although at first I was surprised, the French Revolution, I understood after the conversation why this was so important to him. Let me give you another example. The notion of story or narrative. This was an interesting one because rather than mentioning a specific event like the French Revolution, this person mentioned a big idea because he discovered through some of his studies that as we think about the world, as politicians talk about the world, as historians write about the world, as novelists write about the world, often their insights and their positions are framed in terms of narrative. A story is told, a powerful story that weaves things together and makes sense of the world. So, as you can see from the quote, One thing he learned is how powerful narratives are in making meaning. But another thing he learned is to be careful of narratives. Look at number 4, where it talks about the importance of being careful and looking for evidence and never brushing aside evidence that seems to challenge a narrative, but taking it seriously so that we don't get entrapped by the narratives that one or another person uses from a perspective of special interest. So I thought this too was a marvelous example of something that had lasted and mattered in a person's life. As I've had these conversations with people, I've often been struck by how diverse their answers are, how people name very different kinds of things. When we think about our world today, it's not hard to point to ideas like the concept of narrative, or the French Revolution as an exemplar of political processes. Many other matters might come to mind. For instance, here we have young children going to vote, and that reminds us of the powerful topic of democracy and democracy's challenges in today's world. Or we might think of the digital revolution and many notions around the digital world and what it means and why it's important. Or we might think of a classic example here, basic machines like pulleys and levers, which are still tremendously important in today's world despite its digitalized character. Or, as we have here with this e-reader on the beach, we might think about learning to learn, and learning to learn any place, even on the beach. If we start looking for important kinds of learning, learning that might matter in learners' lives, there's no lack of opportunities. Let me tell you about another little experiment that I did. I have a long-term association with a conference series called the International Conferences on Thinking. And in 2007, the conference was held in Sweden, and I had an opportunity to ask the entire audience what they felt might be important as students face their complex future. We did a little experiment with this. I asked people to write down their ideas on Post-its. And then we created a big board outside the conference hall where everybody put up their Post-its and tried to group them thematically. So it was very interesting to see what people said. However, after the conference, I also took away with me all the Post-its and classified them into big categories so I could try to see what the trends were in this group for what they thought was important as today's students face their complex future. I'm going to show you a list of the categories. Here are the big categories: empathy, communication, science, learning to learn, mathematics, spirituality, technology, environment, global perspectives, the fine arts, collaboration, thinking, health, ethics, society and its functioning, the managing of conflict, and self-understanding. Those sound like pretty good things to understand better to me. But I have to tell you that if you look at this list, it is not in the order of frequency. It's in a random order. So some of these items were mentioned much more than others. Let me pose you a little challenge. Which do you think should be among the top 4 or 5 items? Which would you put among the top 4 or 5? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. Make your own choices. Which would you put among the top 4 or 5? And then I'll tell you what this group thought. Okay. Let's have a nomination from anyone, a suggestion for one item they think might be in the top 4 or 5. Who will suggest something? Don't be shy. Yes. What was that? The last one, self-understanding. Very reasonable suggestion. How many people think that self-understanding should be in the top 4 or 5? Maybe, a lot. Yes. Very interesting. Well, wait a minute, and we'll see whether you agree with this other group. What's another suggestion for the top 4 or 5? Who else has this? Yes. Global perspectives here, and what are you thinking? Learning to learn. Okay, global perspectives and learning to learn. How many people think global perspectives ought to be in the top 4 or 5? Many people, maybe 65% of the group. What about learning to learn? Oh, a lot of people think learning to learn should be. All right, well, let me not keep teasing you. Let me show you what this group in Sweden thought. That's what they thought. Now, obviously, people can have different opinions on this. I do have to make a comment about number 1, thinking. I've spent a good deal of my career working on the teaching of thinking, so I was happy to see thinking on top. But let's remember, this was a conference on thinking, one of the international conferences on thinking. So as a research psychologist, I really don't count that one. Of course, in a conference on thinking, people are going to put thinking at the top. So I think it should be up there someplace. I'm not sure it should be at the very top. But what's next? What's next is self-understanding, the first suggestion made here. And indeed, self-understanding seems tremendously important. And learning to learn is not very far down the list either. Another thing that struck me about this list when I analyzed it is you will notice that the traditional disciplines are not very prominent in it. Mathematics is way down here near the bottom. Technology, even in our digital world, is way down here near the bottom. Science is way down here near the bottom. Now, I don't think that means at all that the traditional disciplines are unimportant. In fact, I think they are tremendously important. However, as we have this conversation with ourselves about what's worth learning, we might want to consider whether the traditional disciplines, in the ways they are usually taught, with the topics that are usually foregrounded, speak to the lives of today's learners as powerfully as they might. I was also very interested to notice, as a longtime fan of the arts, that the arts came up in the middle as highly relevant to the lives we live and the cultures we engage. Anyhow, this is just another piece of evidence that there is a concern here and a conversation that we need to have with ourselves and among our colleagues about what's worth learning. Now, how can we begin to look more deeply into the kinds of learning that seem to be important when we hear what people say, when we hear the stories they tell about their own learning experiences? Well, one way to get at this is through the notion of big understandings. The understanding of the French Revolution, I mentioned, is a big understanding, or the understanding of narrative another example. That's a big understanding. And these big understandings that people mention seem to have these four characteristics: insight, action, ethics, and opportunity. Suppose, for instance, that I understand the French Revolution in the way that that person did, as a way of looking at the world. If I do that, it gives me insight. I understand the world better. I understand politics better. I understand society better. It also gives me reasons for action as a citizen. I can act on what I know. I can vote differently. I can support various causes in alignment with that understanding. It also gives me an ethical perspective. Remember how that person wrote about the aspects of poverty and so on that drove the French Revolution, and continued to talk about how important that was in his own thinking about his own life. And finally, opportunity. Opportunity for thinking in this way comes up all the time, not just once every 10 years, but all the time. The insights, possible actions, ethical implications are full of opportunity, because the kinds of issues central to the French Revolution are still issues today in one or another form. Every day in the newspaper, week by week in the newspaper. So, a big understanding has these characteristics. And that's what we can look for when we have the conversation with ourselves and ask ourselves, what am I teaching? Where are the big understandings? How can I tell if I have a big understanding? Well, is this understanding I'm trying to cultivate in my students one that delivers insight, one that informs action, one that offers an ethical perspective, and does those things over and over again in the lives students are likely to live? What about big questions? You know, big questions are just as important as big understandings. It's not all about, learning in school is not all about taking away understandings that are already prefabricated. It's also about learning what questions to ask and keep asking as you go through life. Learning what a powerful question is. Here's a favorite example. Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which won the Pulitzer Prize a little more than a decade ago. How many people have read Guns, Germs, and Steel? Few people, okay. Very interesting book. At the beginning of the book, Jared Diamond poses the topic of his book as a big question. He talks about a native from New Guinea. He had done research in New Guinea. A native from New Guinea who asked this very powerful question: why do you white people have so much cargo? Now, what did the fellow from New Guinea mean by that? Well, by white people, he meant people from Europe or Asia, Eurasians. And why do you have so much cargo? The fellow from New Guinea meant, why do you have so many possessions, all this wealth, all this power, these planes, these trains, these trucks, this technology, and so forth, this wealth? Why you white people have all this cargo? And this, for Jared Diamond, was a powerful question. And he formulated it more formally this way: why has Eurasian society, the society of Europe and Asia, gradually, over the past several thousand years, come to dominate the world? Why not societies from Australia? Why not societies from the America? Why did Europe and Asia win the world game? And in the book, he offers some very interesting answers to this question. But what I want to underscore is that this is a beautiful example of a big question, a powerful question. If we look at the history of thought in the world, it's full of powerful questions. In science, why do the planets spin the way they do? In biology, how did human beings come into being? Where did we come from? And the notion of the Darwinian explanation. Over and over again, powerful questions play a key role in the construction of knowledge. And this includes much more general questions too, not just why did this or that happen, but the big why. Why about anything? What are the causes? What's the future hold? Where are things going? So big questions also, just like big understandings, reach for insight. Big questions inform action. Big questions lead us into ethical perspectives, and big questions come up all the time in small ways and sometimes large ways in the lives learners are likely to live. So let's put big questions side by side with big understandings as an important part of what's worth learning. Well, I've talked about big questions and I've talked about big understandings. It's reasonable to ask, in contrast with what? What's the contrast? The contrast is niche understandings. The contrast is understandings that may be technically important but do not come up very often in the lives learners are likely to live. Favorite example number one, quadratic equations. How many people in this room at some time have studied quadratic equations in school? How many have studied quadratic equations in school? Okay. Keep your hands up, please. How many people have used a quadratic equation in the last 10 years? How many have used a quadratic equation in the last 10 years? There are still 5 hands up, 6 hands. How many, keep your hands up, please. How many people have used a quadratic equation in the last 10 years outside an educational context? There's 1 hand left. Yay! Congratulations. So, why do we teach quadratic equations? In order to empower the next generation of teachers to teach quadratic equations. Quadratic equations is not a big understanding. Now, math teachers often get mad at me when I say this. I should remind you that actually my degrees are in mathematics. I like quadratic equations. Quadratic equations are my friend. I find them interesting. And it's perfectly fine for any student to have an individual passion, to be curious, to want to know more about quadratic equations or anything, and to have opportunities to pursue those interests. I think that's wonderful. What we're talking about here is not what might be the passion of this or that individual student, like me. What we're talking about here is what is a good general investment in education. Quadratic equations is not a very good general investment in education. In contrast with what? Let's get back to big understandings. Basic statistics and probability. I'm not talking about fancy things like multiple linear regression or analysis of variance, but basic stuff. Basic statistics and probability. How many people have found it useful to know just a little bit about basic statistics and probability in the last 10 years? How about in the last year? How about in the last month? You see, basic statistics and probability comes up all the time. Not only that, but research on students' understanding of basic statistics and probability shows that it's rather tricky. Students have a lot of confusion about basic statistics and probability. Basic statistics and probability is an area of understanding that's important, it comes up all the time, and we can't take it for granted. It's easily misunderstood. Maybe we should be spending a little more time on basic statistics and probability and a little less time on quadratic equations. What's worth learning? That's the conversation we have to ourselves. Here's some of the ways in which basic statistics and probability come up. Insurance decisions, medical decisions, investment decisions, matters of gambling, political positions. For instance, your political positions often reflect how many people are in poverty, levels of investment, levels of industrial growth, and so forth and so on. And of course, just understanding the world generally, because very often today, when we learn about the world, part of the description is in terms of, for instance, frequency distributions. So many families are like this, so many families are like that, and so forth and so on. Basic statistics and probability come up all the time. Okay, here's another example. Who recognizes what this diagram is about? What's this diagram about? What's it about? Mitosis. Yes, this is about everyone's most exciting biology topic, mitosis. I don't know what happens here in Italy, but in many countries of the world, one of the things students learn is about mitosis, which is the process of asexual cell division. Then they go on to the much more exciting meiosis, which is sexual cell division. Anyhow, one of the elements, one of the things that students often learn about this is the phases of mitosis. How many people can name any phases of mitosis? Anybody name a phase of mitosis? Yes, wonderful. There's somebody. Well, I'm just going to remind you all, in case you've forgotten, interphase, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and everybody's favorite, cytokinesis. I once had a funny interaction with a colleague. I was giving a much earlier version of this talk, and after the talk, the colleague came up to me, he's about my age, and he said, "You know, I still remember the phases of mitosis." And I asked him, "Okay, show me." And so he repeated the phases of mitosis from memory. "How did you remember that?" I said. "Well," he said, "when I was in school, we were taught this trick, this mnemonic trick for remembering the phases of mitosis, so I still remember." So I said to my friend, "That's great." But, my friend said to me, "I have no idea what any of those words mean." Well, mitosis is a good example also of niche understandings. Mitosis is a very important process in biology, very fundamental. If that is your passion, it's very worth learning about. Just like if I like math, I can like quadratic equations. But as an educational investment, it's not a very good general choice to go deeply into the nature of mitosis. What might be a better choice? Well, for example, transmissible diseases. the nature of disease transmission, how it happens in the world, what occurs, what are the mechanisms. Things like through the air, through physical contact, through insects like the mosquito here. How does it happen? What are the mechanisms? What are the dangers? Public health issues, rates of growth of diseases, many interesting and often conceptually challenging things to understand. Now let's test this from the perspective of a big understanding. Does it offer insight? Certainly. It offers insight about how things happen in the world. Does it have implications for action? Certainly. It has implications for personal health care. Maybe when you have a flu, you wear a mask when you're traveling, for example. Maybe you be careful about who you shake hands with. Has many practical implications for action. Does it have ethical implications? Of course it has ethical implications. Many ethical implications for how we conduct ourselves, public health policies, and so on. And what about that fourth criterion for a big understanding? Opportunity. Does opportunity come up in our lives with some frequency where it's important to understand something about communicable diseases? Unfortunately, yes. It's an important thing to understand. So, why not spend a little more time on the complex mechanisms of communicable diseases and a little less time on mitosis? In general, these criteria, insight, action, ethics, and opportunity, provide a basis for having this conversation with ourselves about what's worth learning. And when we look at the world, when we look at the curriculum, there are many, many things that pass this test. Let me mention a few, just to give you a feel for how many there are. There are many big ideas, democracy and its discontents, for example, or, again, transmissible diseases and how they work, or the Darwinian paradigm, the Darwinian explanation pattern, which in fact is relevant not only to the world of biology, but also to the world of ideas, to the world of fashion, to other elements that propagate in our society. So big ideas. Then, when we think about renewing the disciplines, we find even more ideas, what neuroscience offers, behavioral economics, as it's called, bioethics, digital ethics. When we look to the latest developments in the disciplines, there are even more big ideas that seem very likely to pass these tests of insight, action, ethics, and opportunity. Or powerful examples, particular cases and episodes that speak to the world we live in, like the French Revolution, just as I described before, or for instance, the life of Da Vinci and the nature of innovation would be a powerful case study. Or for instance, Ötzi, the Iceman that was discovered a number of years ago, 3,300 years old, and whose lifestyle, as analyzed by examining his remains, tells us something about our origins and our nature as human beings. Or 21st century skills, mentioned earlier, the many skills that might be helpful in empowering learners for the lives they're likely to live. Communication skills, problem-solving skills, learning to learn, leadership, systematic thinking of various kinds. No lack at all of big understandings. So we need to be careful about spending so much of our school time on niche understandings that are experienced by many students as not worth learning. Okay, but suppose you're a big fan of some of these niche understandings and you don't want to let them go. Is there any hope? If we want to have this conversation with ourselves, if I want to speak to myself about what's worth learning around what I teach, I need to seriously consider whether some of the topics that look narrow at first are in fact richer than one might think. Let's begin with the French Revolution. The French Revolution, as I learned about it myself, was not a big understanding. It was taught as a topic in itself. The idea was to understand the French Revolution in itself. But that's not the story we heard earlier. For the person I told you about, the French Revolution functioned as a lens through which to look at the rest of the world. One way we can make niche understandings big understandings is to see whether they can function as a lens to look at larger things. But of course, if that's the hope, we have to do it that way. We have to teach the French Revolution in that way, so it becomes a lens to look at the rest of the world. What about quadratic equations? Can we rescue quadratic equations? Well, maybe. I had a very interesting conversation several years ago at the Ministry of Education in Tasmania. I was sharing some of these ideas there with a number of the administrators of the Ministry of Education, and a lady in back raised her hand, and she said, I can think of another approach to quadratic equations that might be more meaningful. What if we looked at quadratic equations as one example of models of growth? In our world, many systems grow, diseases grow, economies grow, populations grow, and of course they also shrink, and shrinking is part of models of growth too. Those patterns of growth have a mathematical nature. Sometimes there's quadratic growth, sometimes there's linear growth, sometimes there's exponential growth. Growth is an important phenomenon to understand. What if we repackaged quadratic equations as one of several tools for understanding the nature of growth? Well, I found that a very persuasive argument. I could easily see quadratic equations could be much more meaningful packaged that way than in the usual experience. However, one has to recognize that there's another side to this story. If that's what we teach quadratic equations for, we would teach quadratic equations in quite a different way. It wouldn't look like the old quadratic equations. It would have a very different flavor and style set side by side with other mathematical patterns of growth. Not only that, but the lady's comment prompted me to think about something else. The very idea of mathematical modeling of growth or anything else is a big understanding. And it's a big understanding that's tremendously important throughout mathematics. Of course, you can think about complex models like the diagram on the left, but it's also worth recognizing that the simplest arithmetic is mathematical modeling also. If we imagine a carpenter looking at a situation, thinking how much wood would be needed, saying, I need this many pieces of wood this thick and this long, adding it up and going to the lumber store to buy the wood, that's mathematical modeling. Mathematical modeling involves translating a situation into a mathematical representation, manipulating the mathematical representation, and then going back to do something in the world. That can happen just as easily with basic arithmetic as it can happen with advanced algebra or calculus. What if the big understanding of mathematical modeling were made part of the curriculum from the very beginnings of mathematics? What if that big understanding was emphasized over and over again, and the power of this cycle of beginning in the world, translating into a mathematical representation, manipulating it, and going back to the world, with all sorts of different mathematics, including very elementary mathematics? Wouldn't that give quite a different picture and experience of mathematical understanding than the emphasis on computation typically does? So, no lack of big understandings, and many ways of rescuing what initially looks like niche understandings to amplify them. But we do have a bit of a problem here. And the problem is a pretty simple one. By now, you must be getting the idea that there are lots and lots of big understandings out there, and lots of big questions out there. How do we deal with that? The reality is, and you can view this as good news or bad news, but the reality is that if you begin to look closely at the disciplines, although typically we often teach niche understandings, any discipline is full of big understandings. It's not difficult at all to discern how history or literature or mathematics or biology or physics has big things to say about the lives learners are likely to live. And when you start making a list of all the truly rich ideas that might be learned and of all the powerful questions that might be learned, you quickly realize it's far too much to teach. How could we possibly deal with that challenge? Remember, we're having this conversation with ourselves, a conversation about what's worth teaching and what's worth learning. But at the end of it, we have to make decisions. We have to decide what to put on the table. We have to decide what knowledge to cultivate. So how are we going to make those choices? It seems simply impossible. Even if we just focus on the big understandings and the big questions, it still seems simply impossible. There's just not room. Well, to me, I found some inspiration in the teaching of literature. Any teacher of literature has recognized this difficulty. If you are teaching, let's say, 20th century Italian literature, or 19th century American literature, or any body of literature, there are always far too many worthwhile works to pay attention to. Far too many, by a factor of 10 or a factor of 100. So teachers of literature have learned how to cope with the impossible choice. And what they do is a strategy that might be called smart sampling. You draw a sample from the possibilities, but it's not a random sample, it's a smart sample. Here are some of the characteristics of these smart samples that teachers of literature use. There's a kind of a criterion of richness. Teachers of literature look for exemplary works. They look for works that are accessible to the learners in question. So you don't have 10-year-olds reading Proust, for example. And they look for works where the particular is a home for the general, works from which one can learn general things as well as engaging the rich particulars of the work of literature in question. Those are criteria for individual choices, but there's also criteria for the ensemble. Variety. You don't want works all of just the same kind. You want different types different genres. You want works that are close to home, more familiar, but you also want works that are further away, a little different, a little beyond the boundaries of the learner's experience. And you also want works that represent diverse perspectives on life. Now, I should say that I didn't just make these up. Actually, I and a research assistant talked this over with teachers of literature and also examined the standards in several countries for the teaching of literature. And it turns out that these are quite typical, that many countries basically have frameworks for the teaching of literature. I don't know what the situation here is in Italy, but many countries have frameworks for the teaching of literature. And basically, those frameworks tend to say this: of course, you as a teacher need to make personal choices. Here are some criteria for those personal choices. Sometimes those frameworks also say, here is a hot list of suggested particularly good candidates. Sometimes those frameworks say, you really ought to be sure to teach these 3 works, whatever else you do. But basically, these national frameworks recognize that there is an impossible choice, that you can't teach it all, and that therefore there's room for individual judgment on the part of educators about what to put on the table, but with a guiding principled framework that emphasizes criteria of richness and variety. Now, this is a set of principles that could be applied to any discipline, not just to literature. For instance, history. What history do we teach? What history might we teach today, given that we're trying to take a global perspective? Given that there is so much history to choose from, the history of any nation, of the nations around it, of the world, a big history as it's called, so many choices. What do you do? Well, why not apply these examples? Why not look for episodes and periods from history that are particularly rich examples, that are accessible to the students involved, where the particular is a home for the general, as in the case of the French Revolution, for example. That's a case where the particular is a home for the general. Why not look for for variety, for range, for diversity? The French Revolution is not quite the same kind of revolution as the Chinese Revolution. And that's not quite the same kind of revolution as the American Revolution. What are the differences? What are the similarities? And other things that we call revolutions, like the Industrial Revolution or the Digital Revolution, are even more different. Range, variety, cases close to home, cases far away. Interestingly, there's some research that shows that students in a given country may often understand better cases that are far away than cases that are close to home, because they lack detachment from the cases that are close to home, and diverse perspectives. So I take heart from this example from literature of smart choice, smart sampling, and feel that as educators, when we have this conversation with ourselves, when I ask myself, what's worth teaching, what am I going to put on the table, that I have a certain latitude within a framework to make those difficult choices. Okay. Well, all of this conversation so far is kind of in a vacuum. It doesn't reflect the other challenges that are out there in the political context. So let me say a word about 3 of those challenges that are at least very prominent in several countries that I know a bit about. Here are 3 other agendas very prominent in education, much more prominent than what's worth learning: achievement, information, and expertise. And I'm going to say just a few words about each of them. In many parts of the world, achievement as measured by standardized tests is in the foreground of educational attention. Countries are very concerned with good performance in areas of basic literacy, basic mathematics, and basic knowledge. Enormous effort is invested in closing what's called the achievement gap. The way education falls short for some students does not seem to be lifting up to the level of performance that we would like. One of the ironies of all this is if you look at the mission statements across nations, you often find a nation saying something like this: by the year 2020, we want to be among the top 3 in the world. Or by the year 2020, we want to be among the top 5 in the world. Well, how can 50 nations all be among the top 5 in the world? There's something fundamentally wrong about this notion of achievement as a race between nations to see who can achieve the most. Now, don't get me wrong. The achievement agenda is very important. We do want to improve performance. Basic literacy and basic mathematical understanding are very significant for the lives that learners are likely to live. However, let's recognize that those standardized achievement tests do not necessarily measure real understanding of those areas very well. And let's also recognize that a problem with the achievement agenda is that it tends to mask other agendas. It's not that it isn't important in itself, but at least in many settings I know of, there's nothing else on the table but achievement. It's all about achievement. And understanding in other richer subject matters suffers because there's so much emphasis on preparation for exams. Anyhow, therefore, when we have this conversation with ourselves about what's worth learning, we have to bring it into balance with the agenda of achievement rather than letting the agenda of achievement dominate everything. Let's turn to the second agenda here, the agenda of information. The idea here, very popular with parents, is that my children should know a lot. They should know dates, they should know names, they should know geography, they should have all this information at their mental fingertips. Well, again, this is not an unimportant agenda. It is good to have a fair amount of basic knowledge about all sorts of things. Knowing things is a good endeavor. However, let's be realistic. Remember the small world we live in. Remember the way education is reaching beyond many of the traditional boundaries, beyond the local, beyond individual disciplines. There's no way that anyone can reasonably know all the worthwhile facts that are out there. There's no way that anyone can reasonably have all the skills that are out there. The agenda of stuffing people's heads with information in its most central form is simply impossible. Moreover, remember we live in a digital age where information is very easy to get. So much more so today than even 50 years ago, the notion that it's important just to have a lot of facts at one's disposal makes very little sense. So again, I don't think we should be against information. I think it's good to have information, and there can be a fair amount of that. However, in some contexts, the reach for lots of information pushes out other educational agendas. So when we have this conversation with ourselves about what's worth learning, we have to bring it into balance with the information agenda and not let the quest for lots of little pieces of information dominate the development of big understandings and big questions. Finally, expertise. In a way, this is the most challenging one and the most provocative one. I need a little diagram to explain this. It's very interesting to look carefully at the structure of curriculum through the years of education, from first grade to fifth grade to 10th grade to 12th grade and so forth, and see how it's constructed. Curricula in the disciplines are typically constructed according to a principle of increasing technical expertise. The idea is to move students along, especially the most able students, to more and more sophisticated and technical aspects of the disciplines. I want to suggest something shocking, really, that for most students that's not such a good idea. What that leads to is an emphasis on what I called niche understandings, like quadratic equations or mitosis. For most students, that doesn't make sense. There's another way of thinking about it, and that is that the disciplines, instead of looking inward toward their technicalities, should look outward toward how they illuminate the lives learners are likely to live. What we really should be cultivating is not so much advanced expertise as expert amateurism. That's the way I would say it in English. Expert amateurism. That is to say, understanding very well in an active, generative way the fundamentals. For example, recall our discussion of statistics and probability. It's much more useful to understand basic statistics and probability really well, so you understand some basic considerations, say, about gambling or about insurance decisions or health decisions, to understand those basics really well in an active, generative way than it is to know a little bit about multiple linear regression or a little bit about analysis of variance or something like that. Typically, in life, a robust, strong, flexible understanding of the fundamentals is more important than a fragile, marginal understanding of sophisticated, advanced topics. But again, if you look at the way curricula are constructed, that's not the principle on which they're constructed. They're typically constructed to lead people along to the advanced topics, particularly the better students along to the advanced topics. I want to suggest that that's a mistake. So we've talked about those three agendas. Let me say just a word about the European Union framework for key competencies, to relate all this to that, because I know that this is something that you live with and puzzle over. Broadly speaking, let me say I think the European framework is rather good. It highlights these four big objectives: personal development, active citizenship, social cohesion, and employability in a knowledge society. What about our criteria for big understandings? Do those speak to the lives learners are likely to live? Of course they do. Of course they do. That's a good thing. Of course we want personal development. And of course matters of personal development come up all the time. Of course we want active citizenship and so on. What about the particulars? Well, there are 8 particular areas of competence that are emphasized. Communication in the mother tongue, in other languages, mathematical competence, digital competence, learning to learn, and so on. And we could, but we don't have time, talk about the details of some of these. Anyhow, as I look at these, I ask myself, do these pass the tests as broad areas? Do these pass the criterion of potentially offering insight action, ethics, and opportunity. And I think, yes, I think these are pretty good areas to look at carefully and to pursue in terms of developing students' capabilities. So I rather like the European framework. Are there other frameworks out there? Of course they are. One of the things I have done is survey various frameworks around the world, and they're somewhat different, but they also have a clear affinity to one another. They're rather in the same spirit, so to speak. But I think this is pretty good. However, there's a catch to all this. There's a remaining puzzle, and that is, okay, what do we leave out? If we're going to now pay close attention to all of these, what gets left out? Do we leave out quadratic equations? Do we leave out mitosis? Do we leave out the French Revolution? How do we make the choices? In elementary school, any student knows that addition is easier than subtraction. Well, this is also a phenomenon with the various frameworks that have been proposed, not only by the European Union, but by other nations around the world and other consortia around the world. These efforts to construct frameworks often define very positive, valuable areas of learning that need emphasis. Rarely do they confront the problem of what to leave out. What to leave out is politically much more sensitive than what to put in. So I like the European framework. I think it, broadly speaking, passes the test well of big understandings and big questions. But a puzzle with it, as with other frameworks, is that it does not confront the big question about what to leave out and how to make those choices. Okay. Time to sum up. I've been suggesting that we should have a conversation with ourselves. Each of us individually, as educators, should have a conversation about what's worth learning. I'm suggesting that it's a difficult conversation. It's very challenging. It's very political, but it's an expression of our dream that the education we offer in our classrooms should be an education that students can embrace, can commit themselves to, can find joy in, can find meaning in, and can pursue with energy. That leads us to this fundamental question: what's worth learning? And indeed, what would our students experience as worth learning? We have to educate for the unknown. We have to make the best bets we can in a complicated world that's going in directions that are somewhat uncertain. And it is our responsibility as educators to have that conversation with ourselves and among ourselves to make those best bets. In having that conversation, we need to reimagine education as a pleasurable, important, central experience in learners' lives, as life-worthy education. We have to remember that we're living in a small world and an uncertain world, much more unstable than, say, the life a typical child would have lived 600 years ago, or even 100 years ago. We need to look for big understandings and big questions. Look to the disciplines we know for those big understandings and big questions as prime candidates for what's worth learning. We need to renew the disciplines, not just be happy with the disciplines as they have been with their traditional content, but look to areas like neuroscience or contemporary peace studies for new, rich ideas. we need to engage in smart sampling, because even if we leave out all the niche understandings, there's still far too much worth learning in point of fact. We can't possibly teach all that's worth learning, or even a large fraction of what's worth learning. We have to make those big choices, and we can take a guide from the teaching of literature about one way to think about making those big choices with smart sampling that is attentive to rich individual choices and to an ensemble of choices that's diverse. And as we organize learning in the disciplines, we might think of it in terms of expert amateurism rather than the rush to advanced technical expertise, and emphasize the robust, flexible understanding of fundamentals. And as we have our conversation with ourselves about all these themes, we have to reach a balance with other educational agendas that often dominate the conversation. The agendas of achievement, of information, and of expertise. Well, this is a complicated conversation we have to have with ourselves. But if we want to live on in our commitment to that dream I mentioned at the beginning, it's a conversation we have to have. Let me close with a metaphor. This is a ink brush painting by Hakuin Eikaku, a Japanese artist, but more important, a Buddhist religious leader. It's called Two Men Crossing a Log, Two Blind Men Crossing a Log. Look at the painting. Notice how the blind men are crossing the log. They have their sticks out. They're feeling their way. They're advancing intelligently across this huge space, because under the log is a chasm in which they might fall. Now, my understanding is that in the Buddhist tradition, this is a metaphor for the quest for enlightenment. The notion is that in the quest for enlightenment, you don't know exactly where you're going. You have to feel your way. It's not like you have a reliable road map that you can follow. It's not like you can see clearly what's over there. You have to feel your way. I have also found this image inspiring from an educational standpoint. It seems to me that, like the two blind men, we are very much in a similar position as people trying to rethink the future of education in the face of the unknown. We can't be sure where the world is going. We are the two blind men on the log, trying to feel as best we can a good way forward in behalf of today's learners. Notice what we are not doing, though, which is also what the men in the image are not doing. We are not simply stepping out boldly and taking a walk to see how far we can get. I often feel that educational policies and political perspectives on education are doing exactly that. They're just stepping out boldly, hoping to end up in a good place, and confident that they are ending up in a good place, but in fact, in 2 or 3 steps, falling off the log. That's because they're not having the conversation with themselves that we want to have with ourselves. They're not trying to think deeply about what is truly worth learning for our era. So let me invite us all to be like the two blind men on the log and feel our way forward slowly and thoughtfully to a better future. Thank you very much. Thank you.